continue this series of lectures and discussions and thoughts about the history of Vietnam and the Vietnamese people. In the last session, we looked at the period sort of a kind of decline, a fragmentation of Vietnam, both politically and culturally, where power was descending down to villages, where families were becoming more important than the nation. And the idea of rule, the ideology, was more and more brought in for social customs and for politics from China. And we call this Neo-Confucianism. In Vietnamese, it's Tom Nho, the Chinese version of Confucianism, which was developed under the Sung dynasty in China. And as you may remember, it was also a period of real divisions and lots of war, that various families came to power. The Lay family still ruled as the emperor from Hanoi, but was very weak. The Trinh clan had power down through here, and another family, a Nguyen family, had power here, and then began really the full conquest of today's Vietnam by moving south into territory which had been taken over from the Cham people, and then by about 1780 taking over all this territory here, which had been part of the Khmer Empire. The Cambodian people centered up here, and they had come down here, but the Vietnamese moved in and took this over from the Cambodians. And then towards the end of the 18th century, another family, also with the last name of Nguyen, but usually called the Tay Son for Western Mountains, arose in the highlands here and began to assert its own power. And they attacked south, and they conquered the center from the other Nguyen family. And then they went up north. They first tried to help the Lay emperor, but then the Lay emperor turned against them and fled over to China. They defeated the Trinh, and then one member of this family, by the name of Nguyen, who took the reign name of Quang Trung, he defeated an invading Chinese army and set up his own sort of dynasty. But he died only after several years, leaving a young son, and then his family the different relatives began fighting and struggling among themselves. They lost their power of leadership, and that other Nguyen family began down in Saigon to come back to power and conquered all of Vietnam by 1802. And that man, whose name is Nguyen An, or Nguyen Phuc An, started a new dynasty, the Nguyen dynasty, in 1802, and he took the reign name of Ya Long. He took the Ya from the community down here of Ya Dinh, which is right near today's Saigon, and he took the Long from the old name of Hanoi, which was Tang Lum. And so he becomes the Emperor Ya Lum, ruling from the south to the north. Now, today I'd like to set up what happens to Vietnam in the 19th century. Really, one thing happens to Vietnam in the 19th century. The French arrive and impose colonialism. And the Vietnamese, led by the Nguyen dynasty and others, are unable to resist the French. And that's sort of the story I want to talk about in the next two lectures. And to set that up, I want to draw a stronger contrast between the Tay Son ruler, Nguyen, and the other man, the other Nguyen, Ya Long, who sets up the Nguyen dynasty, because they had two different philosophies of rule. And what I want to argue today is that the philosophy of rule and the patterns of rule selected by Ya Long and the Nguyen dynasty set Vietnam up for failure. They were designed to protect the interests and the power of the Nguyen family and clan to rule. But when some different, very strange thing came in from abroad, the French, these techniques and these devices failed. And one reason they failed I want to talk about is that they had not engaged the loyalties of the Vietnamese people. It was a strategy of rule by control, not a strategy of rule through loyalty. And secondly, these ideas, these Neo-Confucian ideas, were emphasized more and more and more by the ruling family. And as these Neo-Confucian ideas were pressed down on the Vietnamese, they ratified the power of families, which again was a divisive sort of a social cultural effort, because people began just worrying about the family, not about the clan, not about the country or something like that. So this Neo-Confucian concept of filial piety, of submission, had not actually prepared the Vietnamese to take up arms and fight against the French. So that's sort of the overview of this period from about the late 18th century to the early 20th century. It's a question of short-term success and long-term failure vis-a-vis the West, vis-a-vis the French. Now, I'd like to begin by reading some documents from Quang Trung, Nguyen, which I think will give you a sense of the way he was thinking. And the first document I want to read is the speech he gave to his soldiers in 1789, just before they're going to attack the invading Chinese army. And there's a tradition which goes back to, as we talked before, particularly of Trung Hung Dao and Ly Tung Kiet and these great Vietnamese nationalist military leaders who, before their troops went into battle, the leader, the king, would remind them of what it meant to be Vietnamese. It was a nationalism. It was drawing on those things we talked about history, about geomancy, about the great kings, about Vietnam's destiny as an independent southern kingdom. So Nguyen says to his soldiers, the Qing, that's the Qing dynasty from China, have invaded our country. They are occupying Tanglam, the old capital of the Li dynasty here. Are you not aware of the situation? In the universe, each constellation is assigned a specific place, and on Earth, each country has its own government. This is echoing the short poem of Ly Tung Kiet, that in the southern emperor rules in the southern land. That's written down in heaven's book. It echoes what Nguyen Chai wrote after they defeated the Ming, that the southern customs and the northern customs are different. The Vietnamese have a right to be independent and autonomous. The Chinese do not belong to our race, Yang Tap. Therefore, their intentions must be completely different from ours. From the Han Dynasty to the present day, how many times have they not raided our country, massacred our population, emptied our treasuries? No one in our country could bear this humiliation, and everyone wished to drive the enemy out beyond our borders. Under the Han Chinese, there were the two Trung queens. Under the Sung Chinese, there were Din Tian Huang and Lei Dai Han, Lei Wang. Under the Yuan, the Mongol dynasty, there was Trung Hung Dao. Under the Ming, there was Lei Tai To, Lei Lai, the founder of the present dynasty. These heroes could not sit silently and watch the enemy indulge in violence and cruelty towards the people. They had to comply with the aspirations of their people. This is not, already we can say, this is not a Neo-Confucian kind of ideology about filial piety, about listening to the wishes of heaven, about doing your duty. It's about the tradition, it's about emotion, it's about the people. A single battle was often sufficient to overcome the Chinese and push them back into their country. Throughout all these periods, the South, Nam, remember Nam Day and Back Day, the Southern Emperor, the Northern Emperor, the South and the North were clearly separated, echoing the Li, the Trung, and the Lei. There were no incidents along the frontier areas, while successive dynasties enjoyed long lives. Since the Din dynasty, we no longer suffer as we did when we were subject to Chinese domination. Is this an advantage or an inconvenience, a success or a failure? I let you be the judges of the situation. But the examples of the previous dynasties provide an obvious pattern of conduct. Today, the Qing have returned again. They are determined to annex our country and divide it into provinces and districts to impose their rule. How can they not be aware of what happened to the Sung, the Ming, and the Yuan, the Mongols? For this reason, I am assuming the leadership of the army to expel them. All of you are in complete possession of your intelligence and your capacities. Therefore, you should help me achieve this great undertaking. So that's sort of the spirit of Nguyen Quang Trung. Now, I found in this book, La Sang Fu Tu, which I was reading actually after the last lecture, I'd forgotten about this. I think a fascinating document which was written for Quang Trung about the same time as this statement, which is his justification for becoming emperor. and saying he's no longer subordinate to the lay emperor. He's saying, I am going to be a day, and he takes the name Quang Trung. And this will just be a very, very rough translation because it's in Vietnamese. He said, our nation of Dai Viet. First of all, he uses the Vietnamese word nước rather than quoc, which is the Chinese word. Nước it also means water. It's this very sort of, I think, always the echo of something that heaven has ordained. The water flows, the mountains are there. And our nation of Dai Viet, he uses again the old name, Dai Viet. From the different dynasties, Din, Lê, Lý, Trung, has been independent. This has happened again and again, not just for one clan only. And this, therefore, these great men have come up because of heaven. This is the work of heaven, not the work of men. But at this point, the lay have lost their power. The Trinh and the Tay Son, the other Nguyen family, have been fighting each other. This has been going on for over 200 years. There's been chaos and anarchy in the country. The king, the lay king, he just held to his name. Heaven and earth were broken apart, and I don't see anybody who could do anything about it. There has never been a time as bad and as unhappy as there is now. And for several years now, the South and the North have been fighting each other. The people are suffering. I am just an ordinary person from Tay Son. I don't even have a square meter of land to call my own. Before, I never had any ambition to be a king. My heart was one of someone who hated anarchy and chaos. I wanted to have, this is a concept, a Minh Chúa. Minh is an enlightened person. Chúa is Lord. A Minh Chúa, some sainted person of incredible ability, of great prestige, of great duk, of great virtue, of great uy tín. This Minh Chúa would come down, and everybody would follow the Minh Chúa, and he would bring about peace and get rid of the enemies. I've just wanted to have a Minh Chúa to help the people, to help life and to yin yang and peace for the people. I organized another concept, Nghĩa Bin. Nghĩa means righteousness. Bin is soldiers. I organized some guys who wanted to fight for what was right and just. And I helped my brother to fight and to create the state of Tay Son. In the south, I defeated the Siamese and the Cambodians. I then turned around and I captured Hue and I captured Hanoi. Because I want to end the anarchy, to save the people, to bring them out of the fire, and give the power back to the lay king, that's what I did. But I was disappointed. I could not realize this. I wanted to serve the lay, but the lay king abandoned the nation. He lost the nation. Muk sa tak, bo nuk chai đi. He left the country and ran over to China. And so, following the ways of heaven is very difficult. I see many difficulties ahead. But I know that following the idea of heaven is the proper role for people. I accept the idea of heaven. The people of the North have asked me. They no longer want to follow the lay. They want to follow me. But my brother has a different idea. He just wants to hold Nguyen and just to be a lord of a local region. But the people are calling out. All the leaders, the civilian leaders and the military leaders, Van Va Tung Si, have asked me to become the emperor in order to bring peace to the hearts of the people. So that's expresses a philosophy and approach steeped very much in history and the notion of the great leader who is out there, who is acceptable to heaven above and the people below. But as I said, Nguyen dies fairly young. His family cannot hold on. And Yalong of the other Nguyen family, the Nguyen Phuc family, comes up and establishes all of Vietnam. Now, there are several things I want to say in summary about the policy of Yalong and what he did as the king. First of all, he took two principles to establish his rule because he was a very mistrustful man. There are many stories about Yalong. He didn't trust anybody, which was probably justified by his experience as a young man being defeated here, running away, going into exile, going to Thailand, having good days and bad days, winning battles, losing battles. He came out of this a very hard and tough man who didn't trust people. We'll have some more on that. So the first aspect of his policy of rule was to use Tay. Tay is his Vietnamese concept of power of force. You do something not because you want to, but because I have the Tay to make you do it. You may not like me, but you listen to me. And Tay is, I think, understood by many Vietnamese as also some part of fate and destiny in heaven. If I have a lot of Tay, that's a reality that's happened. I may not be a good person, but I have Tay, and if I have Tay, I can use it. With Tay, you appeal to people's self-interest. You appeal to their fear. With Tay, you give people jobs, you give people money, or you deny them things. If you don't listen to me, if you don't obey me, I'm going to punish you. I'm going to deny you something. And also fear. You don't do what I say, I'm going to arrest you and throw you in jail, or something bad's going to happen. It is a manipulative, sort of Machiavellian way of controlling other people. And it requires a lot of raw power, military power and economic power. And as I mentioned before, it was the way this Nguyen family had developed this part of Vietnam. It was using self-interest, inviting other Vietnamese to come down and give them lots of land. So they'd come take land away from the Cambodians or others. And in return, they would support the Nguyen family. And secondly, it was military force. And in order to have enough military force to maintain their defensive line against the Trinh, they got help from the Portuguese, starting in the 1600s, just as the Thai king did over here, because the Portuguese could make bronze cannon. They could make these great big cannons using Western technology. So the kings in this part of the world, particularly in Nguyen, and in Bangkok, you can go, if you go to Bangkok in front of the Ministry of Defense, you can see some of the huge bronze cannons, sort of round like this, that the Portuguese made for the Thai in the 1600s. So the Nguyen had a tradition of using force and using economic incentives to have people become submissive and subordinate. So the second thing that Yalong did was he brought in very, very strongly this Neo-Confucian ethic, and particularly the concept of filial piety and Mandarins who have to study the Confucian classics, not Vietnamese history. One of the important things about Neo-Confucianism is that it has nothing to do with Vietnamese history. There's no discussion of the Li or the Trung or the Lei or the mountains and the rivers or geomancy or Buddhism or any of these things which over thousands of years had given the Vietnamese their identity. Neo-Confucian thinking is very intellectual. It's about heaven. It's about the orders of heaven. It's about a son of heaven, and it's about filial piety and propriety and respect and subordination to higher people. It's a hierarchical cultural code. And so Yalong brings this in basically to tell the Vietnamese, be obedient, be subservient. A person who is filial to the father makes a very obedient servant of the prince. Don't think of yourself as Vietnamese. Don't think that you're going to rebel. Just stay in your family, stay in your village, do what you have to do, and we will rule the country. Our family, my family, will rule the country. Now, where we can see this most explicitly is in the law code. Yalong brings in the Qing dynasty law code, almost character for character. They add one character from the Lei dynasty law code. They drop they add one article from the old Lê Dynasty Law Code. They dropped 36 articles from the Qing Code, but otherwise it's adopted in Vietnam in Chinese characters. They don't even translate it into Nom, the Vietnamese version. They don't translate it into the Vietnamese language. So it's Chinese language. And this is the imperial law code of the Nguyen dynasty in Vietnam. In the preface to the law code, which is a letter to Yalong by the mandarins who had drafted the law code, the preface indicates that they had read the Lê Dynasty Law Code that we talked about before. So they knew all about this Lê Dynasty Law Code, which was completely Vietnamese. Now, the contrast is, when the Lê Dynasty came to power, they explicitly rejected the Ming Law Code, which was a Neo-Confucian code. So the old Vietnamese dynasty, the Lê, said, we don't want the Chinese law code. We're going to write our own law code, and they did. Now, under the new dynasty, the Nguyen dynasty, they reject the Vietnamese law code and they bring in the Chinese law code. So that's part of Yalong's strategy for rule. The next thing he did was he allowed the villages to be autonomous. It was sort of like a trade-off. It was saying to the mass of the people of Vietnam, if you live within your village communities and you mind your own business, I'll leave you alone. You can have money, you can have rice fields, you can have your own culture, you can marry whomever you want, you can have your ceremonies, your festivals, etc. But you leave ruling the country to me, and to my family, and to my mandarins, and to my soldiers. And so what we saw was this again, continued pattern of decentralization of power, and if you will, fragmentation of Vietnam. Now, the next thing that Yalong did, which was repeated, he actually divided Vietnam into three. And he continued something that the Tay Son had done, which then allows, under the French period into the 20th century, this concept that the Vietnamese are divided into these different groups. And the divisions are the north, or as the French would come to call it, Tonkin, the center, or as the French would call it, Annam, and the south, as the French would call it, Cochin China. Now, if you remember, there were three brothers of the Tay Son family, and Brother Lu had his area of operations down here. Brother Nyak, the oldest brother, had his area of operations down here, and Nguyen went up here, and sort of this was his area of operations. Now, when Yalong united all Vietnam under his control, powerful warlord as the governor general down here, Lê Văn Duyệt. He had another powerful warlord who was the governor general up here, and the court in Hue sort of ruled directly in the middle. So this was again an imposed government using military force in the south, and an imposed government using military force in the north. So the Vietnamese began to think of themselves as three different sort of tendencies, and different tastes in food, in clothes, and in attitudes and behaviors began to develop. North Vietnamese are different, and the language is different from Central Vietnamese. Central Vietnamese language and food is different from Southern Vietnamese. And there are different characters among these three sort of tendencies. As in the United States, we have Yankees we used to have Yankees in the north and Southerners in the south. People who lived in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina had a little different way of talking, and they had different customs, different attitudes before the Civil War and after our Civil War. So this starts to happen in Vietnam, which helps the French later on come into Vietnam and take it sort of bit by bit, piece by piece. Yalong also instituted some other things which we can get a sense for how his mistrust, how his fear forced him, if you will, to use this power and this foreign ideology to come in. Now, as we discuss this and think about it, I want to suggest that there's a very, very powerful parallel between the way Yalong set up the Nguyen dynasty over the Vietnamese and how the Communist Party today sets itself up over the Vietnamese. The two principal techniques of Yalong are the two principal techniques of today's Communist Party. The first technique is Tay, power. The Communist Party, it's power in various ways, police power and economic power. You go along with the communist, you get rewarded. You don't go along with the communist, you suffer. The second thing, remember, that Yalong did from the Nguyen dynasty was to bring in a foreign ideology of subordination. He brought it in from China. The communists bring in a foreign ideology of subordination, only they bring it in from France. It's communism. Communist ideology is Western, especially the version that comes to Vietnam, because the Vietnamese never copied Mao. Mao had his own version of communism in China. But the Vietnamese communists followed the communism of France and Russia, Lenin and then Stalin. And that communism is one of everybody has to obey the party. And at the top of the party is the Politburo. So the Politburo rules, and then it tells the party what to do, and the party tells the people what to do. It is the same pattern as we saw with the Nguyen dynasty. And the fear in both structures, I want to suggest, is similar. Both structures were afraid of the people. Neither the Nguyen dynasty then, nor the Communist Party today can trust the people, because the people don't like them. The people are Vietnamese. The people want this older tradition of individualism, of more kind of personal freedom on all levels. They don't want to have hierarchy imposed on them. They want to have their own phupduk, their own individualism, their own sense of fate. But first, some of the things that Yalong did, even though he brought in some of the Chinese ruling patterns, he would not appoint any official to the top two ranks of high prestige. He wanted no other Vietnamese to develop prestige or uy tín that would cause them to try to overthrow the ruling family, or to think they're better than the ruling family, or to have people follow them rather than the emperor. So the highest rank was like rank 2A and 2B. He didn't appoint anybody. Related to that, he did not appoint like a super PhD. Traditionally in China and Vietnam, a man, who did so well in the classical examinations would be given the title of Trang Nguyen in Vietnamese. Now, a Trang Nguyen is someone whom everybody would respect as a brilliant scholar. Yalong said, under my dynasty, no Trang Nguyen. There will be nobody from outside the imperial clan who will be allowed to establish himself with such prestige and reputation that he might become the center of a political opposition. The next thing he did was he did not bestow the title of Vuong on his sons. Vuong means king. Emperor is up here, king is a lower title. The assumption was that if you were a Vuong, you might have your own bodyguard. You might have your own little court. He didn't even trust his own sons, because he had seen that the Tay Son brothers, each one of them had called themselves a Vuong, and they started having rivalries with each other and actually sometimes fighting with each other. And then his son, well then when he died, the question was who's going to take over? He had, under the imperial Orthodox Chinese way, he should have taken the oldest son of his oldest son. His oldest son was Prince Khan, who had died. There's a grandson. He doesn't take the grandson, which would have been the correct Chinese way. He takes another son who rules by the name of Minh Mang, who was the son of a concubine. Minh Mang's mother was not even an official wife. But Minh Mang was older, he was a mature man, and he was pretty smart. So they go out of the legitimate line of succession to get somebody who's very strong. When Minh Mang comes in, he continues this pattern. One of the things he does is he says there will be no woman, no wife who will be appointed empress. Because there had been a pattern over the dynasties. If you appoint a woman to be the empress, then her son is going to rule. So she, with all her family relatives, begins to manipulate power in the court to make sure that one of her sons becomes the next emperor. And so the other women and the other families then sort of go after her and her faction, and the court falls apart in factional rivalry. What Minh Mang did was, once a son is appointed crown prince, then his mother becomes a Tai Hao, or the mother of the crown prince. So again, you didn't want to build up any rival power to the throne. The other thing Minh Mang did, and I tried to find it and I can't remember it, and maybe somebody does, is since he was not from the legitimate branch of the family, he wrote a poem. And the fourth or fifth lines is Bu Vinh, anh có nhớ không? He has this poem, he wrote this poem, and in Chinese characters. And each generation of his male descendants only could take a name from the character of this poem. So the first generation took the first character, second generation took the second. And in our time, we're down to the letters of Bu and Vinh. So if you see a Vietnamese who comes from this part of Vietnam who has the name of Vinh, he's a direct descendant of Minh Mang. If you run across a Vietnamese who has a family name, a male, has a family name of Ton Tuc, that means he is part of the Nguyen family, but from a non-Minh Mang branch. Because what Minh Mang wanted to do was to make sure the rule stayed with his descendants and would not go to uncles or cousins or second cousins or anything like that. And it basically, that's the way it went, because the last king of the Nguyen dynasty, whose name was Emperor Bao Dai, his name was Vinh Thuy, so he was in the Vinh generation. And I actually met the other month a writer from Vietnam now who came over here with a delegation, and he's also Vinh, something or other, can't remember his name. But he's a descendant of Minh Mang at the same generational level as the old Emperor Bao Dai. Now, Minh Mang then rules for 20 years, 1820 to 1840, as more Neo-Confucian than even the Chinese. And he's absolutely proud of how Neo-Confucian he is. One of the things he does in 1830 is he invades Cambodia. And his mission in invading Cambodia is to turn the Khmer people into Confucians. So he's not invading Cambodia as sort of as a Vietnamese, just to get more land. He's invading Cambodia with a sort of a religious, political mission of indoctrination. So they try to teach, and the Cambodians, by the way, are Theravada Buddhists with a Hindu base under that. They have absolutely nothing to do with China. There's never been any Chinese influence in Cambodia. The Vietnamese under Minh Mang are going over there, trying to teach the Cambodians how to read and write Chinese, study the Confucian classics, have filial piety, and of course, they don't like it, and they resent it and resist it. Minh Mang, there was also revolts under Minh Mang. The powerful lord, Le Van Zuic, who was here, Minh Mang feared but couldn't do anything because he had a lot of support. Le Van Zuic was close to the Catholics. And however, he dies in 1833. And his son, Le Van Khoi, Minh Mang now wants to move against the family. So Le Van Khoi starts a rebellion at the same time, and the warlord up here also starts a rebellion. So Minh Mang, at the same time he's going into Cambodia, he has to put down two major rebellions here. And he also desecrates the tomb of Le Van Zuic, which is outside of Saigon in Yadin. It's called Lang Om. Some of you may have remembered that. If you go there, it's quite a popular tomb where people go and cast fortunes and things like that. The next thing I want to talk about is, there are two subsequent kings. Minh Mang's son, Centuray, who rules from 1841 to 1847, and then Tu Duc, who is a grandson, who rules from 1848 to 1883. Now the French show up and take over Vietnam basically under this king Tu Duc, but the pattern of Minh Mang to Centuray to Tu Duc is the same pattern. In a little while, I'm going to come back to this when we talk about how the French came in, and it was the repression of the Catholics and the killing of missionaries and Vietnamese Catholic priests, which precipitated the French interest in Vietnam and their invasions. We'll talk a little bit more then, but you can immediately see, I think, the necessity for this dynasty to repress Catholicism. Catholicism is a rival foreign ideology to Neo-Confucianism. If you've adopted Neo-Confucianism as the truth, and you're telling all Vietnamese that they have to be Neo-Confucian and respect China, and you have a Chinese law code, and this other ideology shows up, which has no respect for China, has nothing to do with the Chinese. It's some guy, Jesus Christ, who comes from a long way away, and the people who are bringing it there are foreigners. As the Vietnamese would say, people with blue eyes and big noses, right? Mac San Mui Cao. So that's, Minh Mang did something else, a couple of other things in terms of Neo-Confucianism. One is he changed the name of the country. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot one thing. Where does the name Vietnam come from? That was Yalong. Remember, the traditional name has been Dai Viet for generations and generations. Now suddenly it's Vietnam. What happened was when Yalong united all this territory, he then, in the traditional pattern, requested the emperor in China to give him a title, to recognize him and give him a title. And he requested the title of Nam Viet Vuong, South Viet King. And he goes up, and the Qing emperor, Qing Lung, remembers, we talked about this in the first lecture, that there had been an earlier Nam Viet kingdom, which was this area and all of South China under the Qin dynasty and the Han dynasty. For about 100 years, there was this Nam Viet. And at that point, these Viets were just a district of the old Nam Viet kingdom. And at that point, the Chinese warlord who ruled the Nam Viet kingdom had assumed the title of Nam Dae, the emperor of the South. So in 1803 or something, when Qing Lung is discussing this, he remembers this, and he worries that if he gives the name of Nam Viet to Yalong, he is legitimating Yalong's claim to reconquer these parts of China. So he flips the two words, and he calls it Vietnam. So he appoints Yalong, from his point of view in Beijing, to be the Vietnam Vuong, Vietnam Quốc Vuong, the king of the nation, or the king of the state of Vietnam. So that's where the word Vietnam comes from, because the Chinese twisted the old Nam Viet. Now in 1830 sometime, I can't remember the exact year, Minh Mang, the son, changes the name of the country. And there's some significance to this. He now calls the country Dai Nam, the Great South. And no one really quite knows why he did this. I don't think he left a memorial or an explanation. But one of the sort of interpretations is this was completely in keeping with Confucian, Neo-Confucian thinking. Because in Neo-Confucian thinking, nationalism, ethnic identity is irrelevant. Everything is by reason universally under heaven. There are no Vietnamese, there are no Chinese, there are no Japanese, they're just people who are supposed to look up to heaven through the Son of Heaven. And what Minh Mang was saying is that he had the South at the same level as the Chinese emperor had the North. Going back to that old idea of the Nam Dae and the Bac Dae. So he just called Vietnam the Great South, which is sort of a rationalistic, idealistic sense of government. But he dropped the second thing. He dropped the Viet idea. He was not really saying, I am the emperor of the Viet people. He was saying, I rule because I follow the ideas of heaven. And I can rule here, and I can rule in Cambodia. I can rule anywhere because I'm following heaven. There's no special emotional tie or bond with the Vietnamese people or the rivers or the mountains of the South or any of those things. Now, what was the response to the Nguyen dynasty? I think the response was twofold. One was a certain number of families, for reasons, they bought into the system. They were mandarins, they were wealthy families, they were powerful family in villages, they needed the support of the dynasty. or they were intellectuals who believed in Neo-Confucianism. But some of the most important intellectuals didn't buy into the system. First of all, I want to point out that under Yalong and Minh Mang, it was a very, very important Vietnamese called Phan Huy Chu. And in particular, he wrote this very, very long set of historical records about things he had found about Vietnamese history, culture, heroes, things like this. So he was one of the leading intellectuals, Phan Huy Chu, under Yalong and Minh Mang. The second person who is perhaps the most famous, we talked about this before, was Nguyen, the poet who wrote this Tale of Q. And Nguyen served Minh Mang. In fact, he went up to China to be an ambassador of Minh Mang up in China. And while he was there, one of his tasks was to oversee an order of Chinese porcelain made from the imperial kiln of the Chinese, the same kiln that made the ware for the Chinese emperor. It was pretty good porcelain. And he had this, took the designs up and had a huge set made and brought back for Minh Mang to use in the palace. And the design was this picture of, there's a boat with two guys. And this is a famous episode where Yalom Nguyen is escaping. His enemies are chasing him, and this fisherman takes him across a river and saves him. So this is to commemorate the escape of the great founder of the dynasty. But then Nguyen wrote a special poem in Nome characters, and these are the characters, these are the Nome characters, a special poem for Minh Mang. Interestingly, he wrote in Nome, the script for Vietnamese. So if you read these characters, it comes out Vietnamese in sound and grammar. He did not write this in Chinese. So he was trusted by Minh Mang. But when he writes the Tale of Q, as I said earlier, if you want to understand the essence of the Vietnamese, read this. And at the end, when he talks about, well, now I think perhaps the sense of it may come through a little more. This is a story of a tragedy. As I said, the problem that the poet starts out with is, why do talent and destiny clash? Why does somebody who is intelligent, who's beautiful, who deserves everything good, basically have a miserable life? You have talent on one hand, but if you don't have destiny, your life can be just miserable. Why are good people punished? Why do they suffer? That's the problem. And the character who is the good person is a woman, Q. And as I mentioned in the earlier lecture, she's beautiful, she's intelligent, she's talented, she's got a fantastic boyfriend, they fall in love, and he's handsome and he's well studied and he comes from a good family. I mean, it's a perfect match. And then everything goes wrong. And corrupt officials come in and arrest her father. She is then sold by her family into a marriage to get money to free the father, only it turns out the guy's not her husband. He's just a procurer for brothels. He goes around marrying girls under false pretenses and then turns them over to these bad women who keep them as in brothels for prostitution. And then she has ups and downs with clients there, and then she falls in love with a general, and he's going to save her, but then he dies in battle. Oh, because she tells him to be nice and surrender, so he surrenders, and then there's an ambush, and they assassinate him. Then she tries to commit suicide. She can't even commit suicide. And a Buddhist nun finds her, and she's sort of at the end of her rope, and the nun says, "You haven't played out your karma yet. You have to suffer more." So at the end, she finally runs into, by accident, her first love, and they live together, but because she's not a pure wife, they sort of live together like brother and sister, and sort of a sad ending. So then the poet gets to the end and says, how do we explain this? Now, what's the metaphor? A lot of my Vietnamese scholar friends thinks the girl Q is Vietnam and the Vietnamese people. And what the poet is asking, why are the Vietnamese people suffering year after year after year? Why don't we get a Minh Chu? Why do we have to have the Trinh? this Nguyen. The Tay Son loses. Now we got these Nguyen people back again. There's no high spirit among the people. Families are taking care of themselves. We're bringing in all this Chinese stuff. Everybody's unhappy. Why us? What did we do wrong? And so the answer is, this we have learned. Heaven appoints each human to a place. If doomed to roll in dust, we'll roll in dust. If we're destined for high seats, we'll sit on high seats. Does heaven ever favor anyone giving them both talent and good luck? In talent, in your skill, into your ability. I don't care how smart you Vietnamese people are. I don't care how beautiful your women are. You know, don't take pride that you're so smart or you're so beautiful. Because in Vietnamese, the word for talent, Thai, and the word for disaster, Thai, are homophone. They sound the same. Talent and disaster, same thing. Don't think you're so great because you've tested well or something like that. Karma gives us our fate. Don't criticize heaven for being close or far. The scales, the balance, the scales which determine justice are inside our heart. The heart is worth more than all the talent of the earth. Kum dung trắc lần trời gần trời xa, thiên cần ở tại lâm ta, chưa tâm kia mới bàn bà chưa tài. So here's a guy who's serving Minh Mang, this incredibly Neo-Confucian ruler, basically saying it's all about Buddhism. It's all about your individual goodness and your individual heart. There's nothing in this whole thing about sort of filial piety or any of the real Confucian virtues. In fact, a friend of mine, Professor Nguyen, once wrote a little article on this, pointing out all the things that Q does that sort of violate Neo-Confucian standards. Like she and her boyfriend Drum, they sit next to each other on some mat or something, which is against the law. You know, unmarried girl, boy, you're not supposed to get anywhere close under strict Confucian teachings. So we have this great Mandarin moving very much in sort of Buddhist directions. Now, another really famous person, at this same time under Minh Mang, was the woman poet Ho Xuân Hương. Have you guys read Ho Xuân Hương? I mean, she's really, she has word plays, but she's pretty tupteo. She's very vulgar in her poetry, but she does it with puns. And so here you have under Minh Mang, a woman poet. You know, women are not supposed to do these kinds of things. Secondly, she's writing about sex. And that's, you know, I mean, for the old Neo-Confucian tradition, sex is a sort of, it's a destabilizing instinct, right? It's passion, it's lust. We're supposed to rise above that and be refined gentlemen. So here's her poem, Jackfruit. Jackfruit is one of those big fruits, got spikes on it, right? My body's like a jackfruit on the tree. The skin is rough, but the pulp is nice and thick. If you love me, drive into it your plug. Don't fondle it or sap will stain your hand. Scolding some dunces. Where do you think you're going, you bunch of fools? Come here, let sis teach you how to write verse. Young wasps with itchy stings prick rotten flowers. Happy horned kids butt hedges full of gaps. And then she wrote one. She was a minor wife of a Mandarin on being a concubine. One gal lies under quilts, the other chills. To share a husband, damn it, what a fate. I'd settle for just 10, nay, 5 mere times. But fancy, it's not even twice a month. I take it all for rice, some musty rice. I labor as a maid, a wageless maid. Had I but known I should end up like this, I would have sooner stayed the way I was. I mean, she's not accepting her fate, right? This lady's not accepting her fate or all the proprieties of a good Confucian woman. There was, at one point, Minh Mang, he ordered that the women of Vietnam had to wear pants. They should stop wearing skirts. Because with skirts you might see underneath or something, and the Chinese didn't wear skirts. So the Vietnamese women in the north had to wear pants to be like the Chinese. So then somebody wrote this poem. It's anonymous. The 8th month there was an imperial edict forbidding pants without seats, terrifying the people. If no one goes out, the markets will be empty. But how can you go and take the pants off your husband? With pants, you can go to the stall and sell goods. Without pants, you stand in the village and watch the officials. There's sayings about this time that phép vua to a lei lang, the imperial rule falls before village customs. So there is the reaction to Minmang and Neo-Confucianism, I want to submit from the people, is basically negative. Another reaction comes from down in the Mekong Delta, which is sort of religious, which is the sect, the Bu Sang Ki Hung, which is kind of a quasi-Buddhist, Taoist, millennial sect, where this teacher says that there's going to be, and it's very much kind of like evangelical Christianity, that Christ is coming again. There's going to be a Hoi Lamwa, a dragon flower assembly at the end of time. And the great Bodhisattva, I think Maitreya is going to come back, and all the evil people will be punished and go to hell, and all the people with virtue are going to go to heaven and be saved. Again, has nothing to do with Neo-Confucian filial piety or obedience or hierarchy or taking official examinations. The poem, which is written here, which is this poem has magical meaning. Bu ngap quan minh thiên Việt Nguyễn, sống trong xứ mang đảo Nam Tiên, kỷ niệm trạng tai tầng phục quốc, hưởng suốt trình sinh tạo nghiệp nhân. You can read it both ways. You can read it horizontally, which I just did. You can also read it vertically. If you read it vertically, it's Bu sang ki hương, ngap trộm niên suốt, quan sơ trang trình, minh mạng tái sinh, thiên đạo tân tạo, Việt Nam phục nghiệp, Nguyen tiền quốc yên. If you read it this way, it just sounds religious. If you read it this way, it's got all kinds of political meaning. And if you read it the sort of ordinary way, of the precious jade a ruler heaven originally gave to Vietnam. In the mountains of the south, he was formerly told to live. In a miraculous year, the renewed state will be reestablished. The incense fragrance will give birth to a peaceful age. The great ruler, the Minh Chu of Vietnam, is coming, because heaven has foretold this. And it was, we already saw that Nguyen, Quang Trung, was talking about the Minh Chu, the Minh Chua. But if you read it vertically, this poem says, the miraculous fragrance of the precious mountain will proceed out during the jade year. The royal advisor will be Trang Trinh, Nguyen Minh Kiem, and Minh Mang, or the brilliant destiny, will be reborn. That's a pun on the ruler. The ruler's reign name is Minh Mang. But this guy in the Delta is saying he's not the real Minh Mang. The real Minh Chua, the enlightened ruler, is going to come. The heavenly way will be renewed. Vietnam will be restored. The nation will recover its former manner. So here down in the Mekong Delta, among uneducated peasants, is a whole philosophy of opposition to this Neo-Confucian rule of the Nguyen dynasty. Now, I think that's probably a good place to stop. We'll take a break, and then I want to come back and we'll focus in on the French. The French are arriving in Vietnam in this situation of Neo-Confucianism and a Chinese law code used by the court, intellectuals who are not happy with Neo-Confucianism, and the people who live autonomously in their own villages, who follow their own laws, they don't listen to the court, and this vision in the background of a Minh Chu, some enlightened Lord who's going to come from heaven and save the Vietnamese people once again from all these bad rulers. This bowl here. Now, I talked about this bowl, which came from China, and Nguyen Yu had the poem on it. This is another bowl, which was made before that for Minh Mang. And if you can see here, it's got his particular sign. the symbol for sun. And here it says some Vietnamese, this was made in China with this mark, and then some Vietnamese with their own brush and enamel has written Minh Mang Nguyen Hieu, which means this bowl belonged to the reign period of Minh Mang. So this one we know belonged to Emperor Minh Mang of Vietnam. Whether he ever held it in his hands, I don't know. I sort of doubt it, because they probably had hundreds, thousands of these things in the palace. But another thing is, if you look at the dragon's claws, it has 5 toes. Under the rules in China, anything associated with the emperor had 5 claws, any dragon. But nobody else could have 5 claws. Dragons made for the next level of people could have 4 claws. Dragons made, I think, for ordinary people had 3 claws. So this one has 5 claws. And this bowl was made for Centuray, for Minh Mang's son. The first one I showed you, this one, has on the bottom, it has Minh Mang's, the sign of the sun, and it also has, somebody now has carved into the enamel here, the character for lei, which means the Ministry of Rights. So this bowl probably belonged to the Ministry of Rights. So it was probably used in some worship temple for Minh Mang or some senior person of the family. It was put up before an altar, and it would have had soup in it or food or something like that. This one, the one that says Minh Mang Nguyen Hieu, was probably used for eating, in the palace. So, okay, thanks very much. Now, in the last lecture, we were considering the structure of the Nguyen dynasty, 1802 to actually 1945, and the philosophy it took towards ruling Vietnam and the structures it used, which were one, to use power of various kinds, Tay, and also two, to bring in an ideology, Neo-Confucianism from China, to bring up the Vietnamese in a sense of either fear on one side or moral, social, cultural submission on the other, in order to protect the power of the ruling family. Now, there's in life, as the Vietnamese believe, with yin and yang, there are consequences to everything. Whatever you do has a consequence. And one of the consequences of Yalong's decision to set up his dynasty this way was to basically condemn it to failure when the French arrived. The Vietnamese people, but most importantly the palace, the leadership, the royal clan, the ruling family and structure, were incapacitated by their system and their belief to deal with the French. And so they lost Vietnam to the French, because they'd put together something which could work for internal domestic control. It could not work to keep out a foreign power, particularly a new and very different kind of foreign power. Now, at the arrival of the French, there are two parts to this story, I think. One is around religion and Catholicism. The other is the general story of Europe in the 19th century vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Because the European countries created basically modern industrial civilization. And they had more guns, better technology, railroads, telegraphs, science. They could build bridges. They could do things that the Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Japanese, the Africans, the Arabs couldn't do. So in the 19th century is the power of Europe expanding around the world, what we call colonialism. And part of colonialism was rivalries, particularly between the British, the French, and the Germans, in order to establish colonial empires. And so the French had kind of two motives to get involved with Vietnam. One motive was arising from Catholicism, protecting Catholics and advancing Catholicism. The other motive was jealousy with the British and the Germans, so the French wanted to have their own empire. Now, the original French interest in Vietnam, as we talked before, were missionaries in the early 1600s, who came, Jesuits, who came to Vietnam, and they created Quốc ngữ, the Western way of writing Vietnamese, and they had some success in getting Vietnamese to follow them. The Neo-Confucians, at first under the Trinh, who ruled from up here, imposed laws forbidding Catholicism and Christianity. Because the Trinh were also, they were the first to really use this Neo-Confucian Chinese thinking to create a subservient Vietnamese political population. When Yalong is seeking aid, in order to fight back against the Tay Son, Yalong, the first Nguyen, and I'm going to call him probably now Yalong, which is his reign title, he needed to get Tay, he needed to get power. Where's he going to get power in order to strike back at the rival Tay of the Tay Son? The French. So Yalong begins to cultivate the French, particularly some French bishops. One, the Bishop of Adnan, or Pignou de Beher, I think it's pronounced that way. And the bishop, Yalong takes his eldest son, turns him over to the bishop. They sign a sort of a blood agreement between two men, and the bishop takes his son to the court of Versailles, 1787, and an alliance is entered into between the French and Yalong. But nothing happens from that alliance because 1789, there's a revolution, the Bourbon family loses power, the French really don't pay any attention. But the bishop and some French military advisors get involved with Yalong, and they help him in all his campaigns to slowly march up and reconquer Vietnam. And also French military advisors help him build forts in the model of Vauban, Vauban was a French general under Louis XIV who created forts out of brick which were like stars. They had like 5 or 6 points. And they were supposed to be the most sophisticated forts because they could not be attacked. He designed them so that there were cannon openings, would shoot at any little group of men who had to penetrate between the points of the star. So Jalong builds these French-style forts all over Vietnam as the basis for his military units to control the territory of the Vietnamese. But he doesn't promote Catholicism. He doesn't oppose the Catholics, but once he becomes emperor, he doesn't promote it because he's promoting Neo-Confucianism. When he dies, his son Minh Mang takes over. Minh Mang, as I said, is a believer. He's a true believer in Neo-Confucianism. And therefore, Catholicism is inconsistent. And he doesn't want the Vietnamese people to be Catholic. Also, probably because there's a political calculation here. Catholic populations have a hierarchy of obedience. The local congregation follows the priest follows the bishop follows Rome. In that structure of Catholics, there's no obvious place for the emperor. So as the Catholics organize, there's a potential sense of a subculture which could organize itself politically against the ruling family. So Minh Mang begins persecution of Vietnamese Catholics and French missionaries who are coming to spread Catholicism in Vietnam. Under Minh Mang, the French 3 times approach him for a commercial treaty. They want special treaty rights between Vietnam and France, and Minh Mang refuses them 3 times. There's a famous saying by the warlord, Yalong's warlord, Le Vang Duc, who I talked about, that he criticizes Minh Mang by saying that something like, the rice in your mouth is still warm thanks to those people, and you want to betray them. In other words, thanks to the French, your family only got to be the ruler of Vietnam, and you're not grateful, and you want to turn against them. Le Vang is saying, basically, that's not the way a moral person behaves. You owe the French, you owe the Catholics. They put you in power. Now you want to forget about all that and turn against them. By the way, I read the other year in the annals of the King of Siam at the same time, Rama I, that in addition to the French, Yalong went and made an alliance with the King of Siam, Rama I, in order to get a Siamese army to come back here, which it did, and help put him back on the throne. But Nguyen defeated that Siamese army in the Mekong Delta. And this is written in something like 1810 or something. Yalong has been on the throne for a number of years. And in Bangkok over here has a notation that when the Vietnamese king needed my help, he was very friendly and subordinate, and every year he would send me recognition and presents and gifts. Now that he's a ruler and he doesn't need my help anymore, I haven't heard from him for 5 or 6 years. Which sort of fits this image of Yalong as, he just wants to get back in power. If you can help him, he'll take your help. But if he doesn't need you, he doesn't really care and think about you very much. Now, after Minh Mang, his son, Thieu Tri, 1841 to 1847, begins a rigorous persecution of Catholics. Serious persecution, arresting, killing Catholic martyrs. I think several years ago, the Pope recognized, it was 150 martyred Catholics from Vietnam from this period. I mean, a large number. And in the 1840s, 1843, 1847, under Thieu Tri, the French Navy intervenes, shows up on the coast of Vietnam to help missionaries, to save them, to demand their release from prison, or to punish the Vietnamese by sailing into Da Nang and shooting up Vietnamese forts or trying to capture Vietnamese in order to protect the missionary. But the French government in general in Paris is not paying too much attention to Vietnam. The next Vietnamese ruler is Thu Duc from 1848 to 1883. And he then takes a move against the Catholic villages. He breaks up the Catholic villages and disperses the Catholics to live scattered about the country. And he redistributes the land that belongs to the Catholics to non-Catholic Vietnamese. And he threatens to brand Catholics by putting a brand mark, the way our cowboys in the Old West used to brand cattle. You take a hot iron and you stick it and you leave a permanent brand. On the left cheek there would be a brand that said heretic. So everywhere you go, people look at your left cheek and they see the brand and they know you're a heretic. In 1851, 1852, 2 French missionaries were put to death by Tu Duc. The French in 1857, the French demand freedom of religion for Catholics and things like that. They are rejected. In 1858, a French military force, because now back in France, Napoleon III has come to power and the French are beginning to compete for colonies. The British now have a very strong base in Hong Kong and they have great influence in China. The British have India. By the way, they kicked the French out of India in the 1700s. And they have India. They're moving into Burma, 1825. The British are moving into Burma. The Dutch have Indonesia down here. The Spanish have the Philippines. The French have nothing. How can this be? French honor, glory, demands, that we too are a nation, a first-class nation, which in those days to the Europeans meant you needed colonial territories. So a small French force lands in Da Nang, and the Vietnamese put up a defensive effort, and it's fairly successful. They can't defeat the French, but the French can't punch through and go up to Hue, where the imperial capital is. And there's dysentery and the French forces are sick. So the admiral pulls out, and he comes back down here, and he sails up this river to Nha Dinh, or today's Saigon. And he captures Nha Dinh in 1858. And the Vietnamese surround him, so he can't do very much. Another French force is engaged with the British up in China. The war against the Chinese is won, so the French reassign their ships and their soldiers back down here. So reinforcements come, and in 1861, the French conquer this part of Vietnam, conquer it outright. Then they move down here. They take, after the Nha Dinh area, they take My Tho to the south, they take Binh Hoa to the north, and they take Go Kham down to the south next to My Tho. In May of 1862, the emperor, Tu Duc, up here, asks for terms. He realizes he can't fight, he wants to negotiate. So a treaty is entered into, and 3 provinces, right here, are ceded to France. This has consequences in the future. They become French territory. They no longer are the land of the Vietnamese king. They are ruled by the French according to French law. It's French territory. And also Tu Duc has to open up some ports, and he has to give freedom of religion and worship to the Catholics. And so that's the first sort of loss of Vietnam to the French. Then in 1867, the French, and my sense is for no particular good reason, they then take the rest, they take 3 more provinces down here. And they set this up as Cochin China. Now, there's a very important document, I think, which gives us a feeling as to how the Mandarins, the Neo-Confucian Mandarins of the Nguyen dynasty were immobilized. They did not know how to deal with this threat. Remember, these are people who've been fighting against the Chinese successfully for many, many times, over thousands of years. The French show up. Now, clearly, the French have got modern warships. They've got big cannons. They've got high explosives. They've got trained formations. They've got powerful rifles. But still, the Vietnamese Mandarins, the strategic reaction, the intellectual reaction from the Mandarins is one of consternation and resignation. And this is a very famous letter by the Mandarin Fan Tan Yang when he surrenders the 3 provinces down here to the French. He is the administrator of these 3 provinces for Minh Mang. He's one of the leading mandarins in the court. In 1863, he'd been sent to France to negotiate with he's been to France. He's seen Paris. He's seen what these French people look like. He knows their civilization. And he's come back, and now he's the ruler down here. And the French are moving out of the Yadin area, moving south. And he writes his letter, 1867. Officials and people, it is written that he who lives according to heaven's will is in the right way. He who departs from heaven's will is wrong. A classical statement of Neo-Confucian belief and ideology. Has nothing to do with the mountains and the rivers of the south, with the Li, the Trung, Lei Loi, the great heroes, right? It's heaven's way. The rational idea of heaven for the whole cosmos. To act according to heaven's will is to act according to one's reason. If you want to find out what heaven wants you to do, you consult your reason. You don't do geomancy, you don't have prognostications of yin and yang, you don't read Trang Trin's you use your reason to figure out what does heaven want us to do. Man is an intelligent animal created by heaven. Each animal lives according to its proper nature, like water, which seeks its own level, or fire, which spreads in dry places. Man, to whom heaven has given reason, should endeavor to live according to that reason. The empire of our king is ancient. Our gratitude towards our king is total and real. We cannot forget our kings, is total and real. We cannot forget them. For several years now, the French have come with their formidable war material to implant trouble among us. We are weak compared to them. Our officers and soldiers have been defeated by them. Each battle merely added to our misery. The French have huge battleships, full of soldiers, and armed with powerful cannons. Nobody can resist them. They go where they choose. The strongest fortifications collapse under their attack. I raised my spirit to heaven and made myself attentive to the voice of reason. He's not saying, I listened to the spirits of the mountains and rivers. He's not saying, I'm inspired by the Trung sisters. He's saying, what? I raised my spirit to heaven, I listened to reason. I got to think. What does a human being do against this overwhelming force? I said to myself, it would be as senseless for you to assail your enemy as for the fawn to attack the tiger. You would only draw suffering among the people whom heaven has entrusted to your care. I therefore wrote to all the civilian and military officials under my jurisdiction to lay down their arms and surrender without giving battle. He surrenders 3 provinces here to the French without giving battle. But if I have followed heaven's will in averting calamities for the people's heads, I am a traitor to my king in surrendering without resistance the provinces that belong to him. I deserve death. And he commits suicide. I would suggest there are 2 things about Fantanyang's approach here that we should look at. One is this Neo-Confucian intellectualism immobilizes you. It immobilizes your emotions. The second thing is a Vietnamese theme that I suggest that shows up even here, which is fatalism. Fantanyang is kind of saying, this is fate. All the power that the French have with their battleships and their guns, it's just fate. I have not been given enough power. This is the analysis of Tay. So we see in Fantanyang the 2 props of the Nguyen dynasty rule, Tay and power and Neo-Confucianism. The good side of Tay is that when you've got Tay, you can be enthusiastic because you got the moxie, right? You've got the vigorish, as the mafia says here, you know. You got the power. People have to listen to you. You can be a big boss. The flip side of that with Tay is if you don't have Tay, you have to surrender. There's no middle ground. You don't have Tay, you back off, you give up. You don't try to, the Vietnamese expression, which interestingly enough is not used, the only people who use this in contemporary Vietnam are the communists. The expression is Tao Tay, to create Tay. Most Vietnamese don't Tao Tay, they wait. They wait to see what kind of Tay is going to come down to them. Communists go out and Tao Tay. So Phan Yang says, we don't have Tay, and Neo-Confucianism says I must be a humane person. I must spare the people from bloodshed and war, but in that I have breached my duty to my emperor, so I myself am a failure, so I commit suicide. And that, I think, encapsulates this, the immobilization of the Nguyen dynasty, the inability of the emperor, Thieu Tri, Tu Duc, the mandarins, to kind of get a hold of things, mobilize an army, get out there and fight the French, and defend the nation. Notice also in Phan Yang, as I've talked about, there's no reference the way Nguyen Quang Trung said, to the past dynasties, to the glories of the ancient heroes, to the heavenly destiny that Vietnam can be independent, have its own culture, its own values, its own sense of destiny. Now, the other thing that is missing from Phan Yang's letter, and in all this Nguyen writing and thinking, is that sense of individual virtue and duc and Huy Tin, where you have some energy inside you that inspires you to do something. This Neo-Confucian ideology, I submit, really works. If you really believe in it, it disempowers you. It doesn't give you self-confidence. The two things that the Nguyen dynasty put out there to ensure their control meant that most Vietnamese who believed like that didn't have self-confidence. You don't have any Tay, and you got to be subservient. What can you do? Basically, what you pull back and you whine and complain. Let me see. Now about this attitude of sort of impotence. There's a number of poems, famous poems, which have been written. One is by Nguyen Cam Tru. Nguyen Cam Tru was an official under the Nguyen, Minh Mang and others, but he was never very successful as an official. He never got promoted. I think he got fired a couple of times, he was put in jail, and he was brought back, and he finally gives up. And he writes this poem called Officialdom. In age I boast not many scores of years, yet I have witnessed changes through 3 reigns. Yalong Minh Mang, Thieu Tri. In life's arena, fame dwells next to shame. The fame of being a big famous Mandarin is right close to being ashamed of yourself, because you've had to sell out to get this position of power and influence. Born into dust, one cries before one laughs. What's the first sound we all made when we came out at birth? We cried. We didn't smile, we didn't laugh. It's kind of, you think about that, about human life, you sort of go, gulp, no. With past events, I've surfeited my eyes. On things to come, I shan't waste my breath. I'm not going to worry about what fate has in store or anything like that, you know. Such is the high road of the world, I know. A man does what he must to be a man. Not what he wants, what he must. And then, at the time the French are conquering the Delta, there's a southern scholar, Nguyen Chiu, fleeing from bandits. The market breaks at the sound of Western guns. Just one false move, the game of chess is lost. Children flee home to scurry here and there. Birds leave their nests to flutter back and forth. The town of Calf's Haven's riches wash away like foam. The little hamlet of Deerfields, the roof thatch and tile go up in smoke. Oh, turmoil quellers, are you hiding now? Turmoil quellers is like Nguyen, yep luang, yep yak, guys who stand up and get rid of anarchy, get rid of bandits, you know. Where are you? Where are you? Oh, turmoil quellers, are you hiding now? Why let the little people bear this scourge? Where are our leaders? Storm. Where do you keep your armies, O wind god? Unleash your power and tumble ocean waves. Whip, whip, blow off all the temples and all the shrines. Roar, roar, bring down all the forests and all the hills. May heaven storm and sweep our kingdom clean, and then put it back within its rightful bounds. Heaven, you gotta send us a Minh Chu. You gotta send us a leader who's gonna get rid of these French, who's gonna sweep the country clean and put it back to the way it was supposed to be. There was one guy in the South, Trung Com Din, who had a very different attitude than Phan Thanh Giang. I'll read that in a second. And he goes out and tries to raise Nghĩa Quân, right soldiers of righteousness, to fight the French. And of course he loses. I think they get to burn one French ship or something like that, but basically they lose. But Nguyen writes a poem about him. Elegy, after he's dead. Elegy for Trung Din. His fame rose like a billow in the south. Gaucom in battles echoed with his feats. His bullets made the white devil's warships throb. His sword cast glory at the yellow gate. The flag of justice, heavens yet to fall. The captain's seal lies buried under the earth. Why must brave men break down and shed their tears? A murmured prayer is offered to his soul. So the court, the Nguyen dynasty, cannot really figure out a strategy to stop the French, but the Vietnamese people in the villages, without leaders, without relationships with mandarins or intellectuals, they know that there's chaos, there's anarchy under heaven, something is wrong, there's injustice, and they sort of rise up here and there without discipline, without order, without leadership, to kind of fight back. There was an exchange. Yeah, this is after the peace treaty with the French. Phan Thanh Giang, the Mandarin who I read his final letter of submission and surrender before French power and suicide, he writes to Trung Com Din, since the court has signed the peace treaty, the duty of officials is to call off their struggle. Neo-Confucian, piety, filial piety, submission. There is no reason for any exception to this rule. Not even Vietnamese nationalism or anything. Loyalty and filial piety deserve equal praise. Trum Hue, you gotta be Trum Hue, gotta be loyal and with filial piety in order to be a good person. But both have limits not to be exceeded. To surpass these limits is as reprehensible as not to reach them. Were you able to return the court's territory, the entire provinces of Binh Hoa, Ya Dinh, and Din Thuong, yours would be an unprecedented achievement deserving the gratitude of the country. But now, as the main army has been withdrawn, and as the commanders who've gone into hiding have been appointed by the court to various other posts, what can you achieve with only a very small number of troops? You have no Tay. You have no Tay. There's nothing you can do. Give up. Do you really think you will be able to launch a general offensive? Furthermore, will you even be able to retain your current positions? I am convinced that clearly it will be impossible. Trung Com Din's reply. The population of the three provinces would not accept the partition of the country. That was why it chose me as its military commander. We cannot now do other than that which we are doing because we are convinced that we are acting according to the will of the people and that of heaven. That's a Confucian conceit. Yi Chai, La Yi Yang, the idea of heaven and the idea of the people are the same thing. But as soon as you get the will of the people, you're back now to the language of Nguyen Wei and the Tay Son, the people. What do the people want? Remember Nguyen Wei, when he says, I'm going to become emperor, he says, the people have rallied to me to go fight the Chinese. Trung Com Din saying, it's the people. They need leadership. We are therefore determined to give our lives to our struggle. We shall harass the enemy from the east, attack him from the west. We shall continuously fight the enemy, and we are convinced that, in the end, we shall overcome. As long as you speak of peace and surrender, we are determined not to obey the court. Now, here is the first of a major breakdown between the court and the people. Here's Trung Com Din and the people here saying the Nguyen dynasty is no longer legitimate in our eyes. They are giving us orders to do things which we reject. They are not legitimate. We're not going to follow them anymore. Given these circumstances, any cooperation between you and us will be impossible. We hope that you will not be surprised by our determination. Speaking of Drum Hue, it brings to mind much, much later, but a powerful use of that concept. Jumping way ahead to 1975, when the communists attacked, there was a really marvelous commander this part of Vietnam, General Ngo Quang Trung, and he was defending this part of Vietnam. And he was then called back down to Saigon by President Thieu and told to take all the main forces from here and move them down here. And Thieu was going to surrender all this part of Vietnam to Hanoi, and the new boundary would be here. And so I was, the first time I heard this story, I was meeting with General Trung in his house in Virginia, and just listening to this. And he said at one point, he said, I knew that I was one of the Ruang Got. I was one of the principal pillars of the system. If I go, the system collapses. System being South Vietnam and the nationalists. And he said, President Thieu put me in the position that if I listened to him, I would be Hugh, I would be filial, but I would abandon the people. If I went to the side of the people, I would be loyal, but I would not be Hugh. So Thieu put his best commander in a position of being immoral. Whichever way he went, he broke a fundamental rule of sort of Vietnamese leadership. He was either going to be Trung or he's going to be Hugh. And what happened is Trung could not resolve the inconsistency, and his military effectiveness evaporated. He went back to Da Nang and Hue, and he couldn't do anything. He was a broken man because of this issue of Trung and Hugh. And there's also the related thing of Hugh and Nguyen. You had to be Hugh, you had to be filial to your superior, the president, and you had Nguyen. You had Nguyen with the people. And he'd just been told to abandon the people. And he couldn't do either. So I blame Thieu for, a lot of people blame Thieu for a lot of things. But getting back to Vietnam. So 1867, we have a French colony down here. We have Thu Duc still reigning up here. And the people, at least down here, more and more pulling away from the court, saying they're there for themselves. They're not here for us. They're not really here for Vietnam. Now, one of the things about Thu Duc in passing before we go on is about geomancy. Now, even though Yalong and Minh Mang were very Neo-Confucian, they still kind of believed in geomancy. So when the time comes for Yalong to find his grave site outside of Hue, he gets a really pretty good auspicious site. He gets some pretty good geomancers, and they go find the site up the river. It's a pretty good site. And his son Minh Mang also gets a pretty good site from geomancy. Thu Duc, Thieu Tri has a mediocre site. Thu Duc has a lousy site. If you go outside of Hue, if you go to Thu Duc's tomb, what it is, there was a beautiful little lake. And he built a pavilion on this lake, sitting halfway in the lake, halfway on land, with a porch and columns. And he used to go there and he'd read poetry, and they'd do play. He actually did some Shakespeare plays. He translated some Shakespeare into Vietnamese, and with members of his court, they'd do Shakespeare plays there, and he'd have tea and he'd watch the sunset. It was an absolutely gorgeous place to do this. So he wanted to be buried near there. So he just had, so his tomb is just sort of right on the other side of the little road from this beautiful little pavilion in the lake. That's a lousy place. There's no Viet. There's no Viet under his tomb. So when I was there going around once, some older Vietnamese were saying, you see, that's Thu Duc's tomb. I said, yeah, he said, that's why we lost Vietnam. That's right, lousy tomb, no Viet, bad fortune for the dynasty. Dynasty runs the country, bad fortune for the country. Now, after this, there's kind of an interregnum. There's kind of a truce or a peace for a while. But in 1874, a French adventurer tries to captures Hanoi. His name is Garnier. And oh, by the way, there's also more chaos. There's a whole bunch of bandits who are up here, some fleeing from China, some Vietnamese. They're called the Black Flags. They're up here, and the court down here can't control them. Now, some French who are really competitive with the British. The British have Hong Kong here, and they're beginning to develop influence and making a lot of money in China. The French believe that they can use the Red River to go up into China and access the Chinese market. Now, this is absolutely a wrong idea because the Red River has lots of rapids and it's narrow and you can't get boats up it. But they don't, the French in 1874, they don't know this. So this adventurer, Garnier and some others, he goes up to Hanoi. He captures like 75 French guys, something like that, some tiny force. They capture Hanoi. They capture the fort that's loyal to the Nguyen emperor, and the Nguyen officials sort of surrender. And they want to go up here. Two interesting things. One, there is some resistance. The Vietnamese resist and Garnier is killed. But fundamentally, the people of North Vietnam don't get too excited about helping the Nguyen dynasty. Garnier is killed. The French have to pull back. They have to apologize a little bit. But an access point has been made. Now, as a result, there's some negotiations and there's a trading, and Tu Duc gives France full sovereignty over Cochin China, and the French say he doesn't have to pay any more indemnity, and they will give him money and weapons in order to fight the Black Flags. So for him to get some things to help his dynasty against the Black Flags, he gives the French even more authority down here. That's 1874. In 1880, the Chinese come in and they defeat the Black Flags. But in 1881, the French, not to protect the missionaries, but now to move more towards establishing a French colony, they propose military action just to come in here and and conquer this territory. So at this point, another Frenchman with more support from the government, Henri Rivière, in 1882, he seizes Hanoi for a second time. There's fighting, he gets killed, but the French send in more troops. And then in 1883, the French attack Hue. They attack right the main court in 1883. Tu Duc has gone back on his word. The court is weak. They don't know what to do. My sense is the French see an opportunity to go for broke and establish a colony. And then in 1883, Tu Duc dies. And there's no leader within the Nguyen dynasty court and the palace. They're different factions. Young guys are promoted and then demoted, and they're mandarins in the background, and they don't know what to do. There's a dynastic crisis. They cannot respond. They cannot get a leader. They cannot settle on who's going to be the emperor. They can't deal with the French. The French have this. They're coming up there. And they go and they sign a treaty recognizing French as the protector of Vietnam. So the Vietnamese emperor here becomes under the protection of the French and accepts French officials to be his advisors, résident supérieur. And the resident superior has some legal powers in the treaty, but also just has a lot of just power. And so more and more the French are telling the Vietnamese what to do. And so 1884 is an important year where Vietnam is sort of officially submissive, comes under French power and authority. Then a couple of things happen. Basically, in 1885, the next year, there is a revolt. The young emperor, Ham Nghi, in Hue, and some of the mandarins flee, and they go up into here. And they start a movement called the Kung Vuong. It's the name of the movement. It's called, rescue the king, rally to the king, protect the king. And it's a call on the Vietnamese people to rise up and support the Nguyen family against the French. And what do you think the Vietnamese people do? Nada. It's not entirely true, but basically nobody here rises up. Odds and ends of people, but basically nobody. Nobody down here rises up. And a few of the old family relations of the king, the high court mandarins, a few of those people organize a resistance movement, but it only takes the French a couple of years to suppress it. Now, this is the statement of the Kung Vuong Edict. This is the Kung Vuong Edict. I'm going to read it to you. And you just listen to it, and what's your emotional level about this as you hear this? I mean, imagine you're a Vietnamese, 1885, and somebody gets up in your village and reads this thing, you know? The emperor proclaims, "From time immemorial, there have been only 3 strategies for opposing the enemy: attack, defense, negotiation. Opportunities for attack were lacking. It was difficult to gather required strength for defense, and in negotiations, the enemy demanded everything. In this situation of infinite trouble, we have unwillingly been forced to resort to expedients. Was this not the example sent by King Tai in leaving the mountains of Qi and by Sun Tang when fleeing to Shu? Our country recently has faced many critical events. We came to the throne very young and have been greatly concerned with self-strengthening and sovereign government. Nevertheless, with every passing day, the Western envoys got more and more overbearing. Recently, they brought in troops and naval reinforcements, trying to force on us conditions we could never accept. We received them with normal ceremony, but they refused to accept a single thing. People in the capital became very afraid that trouble was approaching. The High Minister sought ways to retain peace in the country and protect the court. It was decided, rather than bow heads in obedience, sitting around and losing chances, better to appreciate what the enemy was up to and to move first. If this did not succeed, then we could still follow the present course to make better plans, acting according to the situation. Surely all those who share care and worry for events in our country already understand, having also gnashed their teeth, made their hair stand on end, swearing to wipe out every last bandit. Is there anyone not moved by such feelings? Are there not plenty of people who will use lance as a pillow, thump their oars against the side, grab the enemy's spears, or heave around water jugs? Court figures had best follow the righteous path, seeking to live and die for righteousness, Nguyen. We're not Nguyen and Zhao Cui of Qin, Guo Tzu Yi and Liang Guangpao of Tang, men who lived by it in antiquity. Our virtue being insufficient, amidst these events, we did not have the strength to hold out and allow the royal capital to fall, forcing the empresses to flee for their lives. The fault is ours entirely, a matter of great shame. But traditional loyalties are strong. Hundreds of mandarins and commanders of all levels, perhaps not having the heart to abandon me, unite as never before, those with intellect helping to plan, those with strength willing to fight, those with riches contributing for supplies, all of one mind and body in seeking a way out of danger, a solution to all difficulties. With luck, heaven will also treat man with kindness, turning chaos into order, danger into peace, and helping thus to restore our land and our frontiers. Is not this opportunity fortunate for our country, meaning fortunate for the people, since all who worry and work together will certainly reach peace and happiness together? On the other hand, those who fear death more than they love their king, who put concerns of household above concerns of country, mandarins who find excuses to be far away, soldiers who desert, citizens who do not fulfill public duties eagerly for a righteous cause, officers who take the easy way and leave brightness for darkness, all may continue to live in this world, but they will be like animals disguised in clothes and hats. Who can accept such behavior? With rewards generous, punishments will also be severe. The court retains normal usages, so that repentance should not be postponed. All should follow this edict strictly. By imperial order, 2nd day, 6th month, 1st year of Ham Nghi, July 13, 1885. Okay, having heard that, you guys all excited about going out and fighting the French? Sure, why not, right? I mean, the quality of the language, and if I could stress again in these Nguyen documents, what's missing? I mean, there's no reference in here to Hai Ba Chung, to Li Tung Kiet, to Lei Loi, to Trung Hung Dao, to this, you know, to the great victories over the Chinese. No emotional appeal to the spirit of Dai Viet. Say heaven has given us all this. You know, we may go down in flames, but we're being true to our ancestors or something like that. I mean, this is sort of trite Neo-Confucian, you know, boilerplate, and nobody basically nobody shows up, and nobody fights for the Nguyen, and they just become irrelevant. Now, there is, however, another side of the story. The French were not entirely stupid. And they were not entirely just militaristic and brutal. They were actually, in some ways, they were fairly shrewd. This is a book written by de Lanessan, published in Paris in 1889. De Lanessan was one of the most strategic and smartest of the French civilians assisting French colonialism at this time. And this is his book about l'Indochine française, the French Indochina, which becomes famous, which was the French legally established that in 1887, after they'd repressed the Ham Nghi revolt, before he writes this, and French Indochina was declared to be the autonomous area of Tonkin, the Annam, which was a French protectorate, the French territories of Cochin China, and Cambodia, which was a French protectorate. I didn't talk about that, but in the 1860s, when the French were coming in here and attacking here, with some pressure from the French, but also with the idea of the Cambodian king. The Cambodians, who had been losing to the Vietnamese on one side and the Thai on the other side for hundreds of years, suddenly thought that if they could get the French on their side, the French would keep out the Vietnamese and keep out the Thai. So in 1864, the Cambodian king signs a treaty with France, placing Cambodia under French protection. So the French would keep the Thais out and the Vietnamese out. So now you have French Indochina, which is this. By 1904, I think the French add the various principalities of Laos to what became officially French Indochina. But de Lanessan writes in here basically a strategy. And the strategy is to make an alliance with the great families. The French strategy is to make an alliance, a marriage of convenience with the mandarins, with the great families, with the wealthy families, with the landlords. And it's self-interest on both sides. It's playing with this concept of Tay. The French now get people who will be responsible to them, who will rule local areas and will cooperate with them and repress rebels. The great families and the mandarins get to borrow French power to sustain their social prestige and their wealth. And it's, as we say, it's a Faustian bargain. It's a deal with the devil for the Vietnamese families. In the short term, it makes sense. Now, I think we can understand the thinking to some extent of these Vietnamese elders and clan leaders and mandarins in the context of Tay and Neo-Confucianism. First of all, in the context of Tay, the people don't like you. You're part of the Nguyen apparatus, which people are turning against. Where's the Tay going to come from to support you, to keep you in your position of superiority? So you switch from the Tay of the Nguyen dynasty to the Tay of the French. One. Two, at this point, Neo-Confucianism doesn't have any power. It's failed. You have no sort of deep cultural roots anymore. You're looking for something new, something different. And the French are bringing over education, science, railroads, telegraphs, all this modern European civilization, which is both an intellectual approach, it's also a new form of Tay. Because if you start sending your sons to be educated by the French, and they get appointed by the French to be the politicians and the ministers, then your family is gaining this new Tay and this new system from modern industrialized civilization. So de Lanessan writes in here, basically, he's criticizing the other people, saying they have wounded the amour-propre. They have wounded the pride of the mandarins. Nous blessons encore l'amour-propre et les intérêts des lettres of the mandarins. And that turned them against us. And therefore, if we honor the mandarins and we take care of their interests, they're going to support us French. So the French undertake a policy of an alliance with the landlord class, the mandarins, and it works. Because those people then abandon the Nguyen dynasty and help the French run a colony. Now, the significant thing here for Vietnam in the 20th century and the war is that the French introduce the principle of class division and class warfare.